The Lindbergh kidnapping is usually remembered as a national shock. A famous aviator, a nursery window, a ransom note, a child taken from a second-floor bedroom. But the part that matters for this documentary is quieter than the headline. It is the paper trail, the ladder, the handwriting, the serial numbers, the ordinary pieces of evidence that slowly turned a mystery into a prosecution. On the night of the 1st of March, 1932, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, disappeared from the family home near Hopewell, New Jersey. The first story was chaos, thousands of leads, false claims, a ransom exchange, a promise that the child was alive. Then the promise collapsed. Years later, the case came down to a man in the Bronx. Gold certificates from the ransom, a handmade ladder, and a courtroom in Flemington. This is not a story about a perfect investigation. It is a story about how a famous crime forced investigators to build a case from fragments. The Lindberghs were not an ordinary family. Charles Lindbergh had become one of the most famous men in the world after his solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927. By 1932, the family was trying to live with that fame at a rural estate in New Jersey. The house was meant to offer space and privacy. Instead, it became the center of one of the most watched police investigations in American history. Official accounts place the abduction on the evening of 1st March 1932. The child was in a second-floor nursery. Others were elsewhere in the house. When the disappearance was discovered, a ransom note was found. Outside, investigators found a broken ladder near the wall beneath the nursery window. That ladder mattered immediately. It suggested method. It suggested planning. It also suggested risk, because whoever used it had to move through a visible open space at night with a child. The first phase of the case was not clean. Local police, state police, federal agencies, reporters, tipsters, and frauds all crowded around the same event. In 1932, kidnapping was not yet a federal crime in the way later generations would understand it. The FBI helped, but the New Jersey State Police led the early investigation. The case began with a missing child. It quickly became a national machine for rumors. The ransom notes became the first narrative thread. The Lindbergh family received repeated communications from someone claiming to control the child's fate. A retired school teacher, Dr. John Condon, became the go-between. In public reports, he was known by the nickname Jafsy. The demand led to a meeting in New York. Condon, acting for the family, paid $50,000 to a man he knew as John. A large part of that money was in gold certificates, which mattered later because each note could be traced by serial number. The payment did not bring the child home. The man who took the money sent the family toward a boat called Nellie. The child was supposed to be there. It was not true. The FBI later described the search for that boat as fruitless. Registries were checked, leads were chased, false claims kept appearing. This is one reason the case is hard to tell straight. It was not one clean line from crime to suspect. It was a mass of reports, some sincere and some exploitative. But inside the noise, the money remained measurable. Every gold certificate had a serial number. Every circulation point had a possible witness. The ransom did not solve the case immediately. On 12 May 1932, more than 10 weeks after the kidnapping, a toddler's remains were found in woods near the Lindbergh home. The Minnesota Historical Society summary says Charles Lindbergh identified the body as his son, and that the child had apparently died the night he was taken. The FBI archive gives the same broad conclusion. The child had been killed shortly after the abduction. This video is not going to linger on the discovery. The details were devastating, and the official New Jersey archive itself marks some evidence photographs as inappropriate for public exhibition. What matters here is what the discovery changed. It ended the hope that the ransom exchange could still become a rescue. It turned the case from a kidnapping investigation into a murder case. It also increased the pressure on every agency involved. Public attention had already been extreme. Now it became heavier. The crime helped push the United States toward what became known as the Lindbergh Law, federal kidnapping legislation that expanded federal authority in cases crossing state lines. But law followed tragedy. Before any national lesson could be drawn, investigators still needed a suspect. And for a long time, they did not have one. The money trail took patience. The FBI records say investigators distributed serial numbers for the ransom bills to banks, stores, gas stations, airports, post offices, and other places where currency might move. The idea was simple. If a bill from the ransom appeared, someone might remember where it came from. In May 1933, nearly $310 gold certificates and one $20 certificate were discovered at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They were Lindbergh ransom notes. But that lead did not identify the person who deposited them. Then the trail quieted again. In 1934, more gold certificates began appearing around Yorkville and Harlem. Investigators marked each recovered bill on a map. The pattern gave them a search area. The break came from a gas station. On 15 September 1934, an attendant received a $10 gold certificate for gasoline. Suspicious of the note, he wrote down the car's license number. That number led to Bruno Richard Hauptmann of the Bronx. The evidence did not arrive as a dramatic confession. It arrived as handwriting on money, written by a cautious attendant who did not know he was moving the case forward. Hauptmann was arrested on 19 September 1934. According to the FBI account, a $20 gold ransom certificate was found on him. A search then led to more ransom certificates, with more than $13,000 discovered in his garage. The New Jersey Archive states that prosecutors later accounted for Hauptmann's investments and expenditures against the ransom payment, less nearly $15,000 found on his property. Hauptmann's explanation was that the money had come from a friend, Isidor Fisch, who had returned to Germany and died. That defense matters. A documentary should not erase it. Hauptmann denied involvement in the crime, and he denied it until the end. But the prosecution did not rely on the money alone. They also had witness identifications. Condon identified Hauptmann as the man who had received the ransom. The FBI records say a taxi driver identified him as the person from whom he had received one of the ransom notes. There was also a resemblance between Hauptmann and the earlier sketch of the mysterious John. In a famous case, a suspect can become a symbol almost instantly. The harder question is whether the evidence can survive being tested. That is where the ladder entered the story again. The ladder was one of the strongest physical exhibits in the trial. From the beginning, police believed it had been built by someone who understood wood and tools. It was crude, but it was not random. The FBI account says a wood expert, Arthur Kaler of the United States Forest Service, was brought into the case. He disassembled the ladder, identified the wood, studied tool marks, and looked at nail hole patterns. The New Jersey Archive lists several trial evidence photographs related to the ladder. It includes the ladder near the nursery window, Hauptmann's attic, rail 16, matching nail holes, wood grain comparisons, chisel evidence, and plane mark comparisons. At trial, the prosecution argued that a piece of the ladder matched wood from Hauptmann's attic floor. This was powerful because it connected the crime scene to a private space. It also shows why the case became a landmark for forensic presentation. The jury was not just asked to hear a story. It was asked to follow marks, grain, holes, tools, and missing boards. In a modern case, that kind of physical comparison would be argued alongside DNA, cameras, and phone data. In 1935, it had to carry much more weight. The ransom notes were another pillar. The FBI records say handwriting experts reached the view that the notes were written by the same person. The Bureau's laboratory later compared the ransom note writing with Hauptmann's samples. The official FBI account says the comparison showed similarities in personal characteristics and writing habits. The archive article says the scientific crime lab studied the notes as part of what became an early success story for Bureau forensics. The New Jersey Archive also lists trial photographs comparing Hauptmann's handwriting samples to the ransom notes. This does not mean handwriting evidence should be treated as magic. It is human comparison, and human comparison can be challenged. But in the trial record, it became one of the main bridges between the notes and the accused. The prosecution did not have one single perfect fact. It had a stack. Ransom money, Condon's identification, the taxi driver identification, the ladder wood, tool marks, handwriting, Condon's contact details found in Hauptmann's home. Each piece had limits. Together, the state argued they made coincidence impossible. That is the central shape of the case. The trial began in Flemington, New Jersey, on 3rd January 1935. It lasted 5 weeks. Reporters treated it as a national spectacle. Britannica describes the evidence against Hauptmann as primarily circumstantial, and that is important. No witness had watched him climb the ladder and take the child. No single exhibit carried the whole case alone. The prosecution built a chain. The defense tried to break each link. Hauptmann said he was innocent. He said he had been holding money for Isidor Fish. He challenged the handwriting process and denied being the kidnapper. At the same time, the state presented financial evidence, witness identification, handwriting evidence, and the ladder analysis. On 13 February 1935, the jury found Hauptmann guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to death. Appeals followed. The New Jersey Supreme Court upheld the verdict. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. A clemency effort failed. On 3rd April 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed. That is the official legal end. The Lindbergh case still attracts alternate theories and criticism. Some of that is inevitable. The victim's family was famous. The press was relentless. The investigation was enormous. The trial happened in a period before many modern safeguards and forensic standards. There were real weaknesses to discuss. The case was circumstantial. Some identification evidence depended on memory and voice recognition. The defense argued the money had another explanation. Later writers have questioned whether Hauptmann acted alone, whether every piece of evidence was handled cleanly, and whether the atmosphere around the trial made fairness harder. But careful criticism is different from replacing the record with a theory. The source-backed core is still this. Official records tie the prosecution to ransom money, handwriting comparison, ladder and tool evidence, witness identifications, and Condon contact details. The jury accepted that chain. A responsible telling can hold two thoughts at once. First, the state convicted Hauptmann, and the legal appeals failed. Second, the case is historically important, partly because it shows how public pressure, celebrity, forensic ambition, and criminal law can collide. That collision is why the story keeps being retold. The Lindbergh kidnapping changed more than one family. It changed American kidnapping law. It became part of the reason federal authority expanded in kidnapping cases. It also became a case study in evidence. The money trail showed the value of patient record keeping. The ladder showed how material objects could be read: wood grain, nail holes, tool marks, missing boards. The handwriting evidence showed how the young FBI laboratory wanted to prove its usefulness. None of that makes the investigation perfect, but it explains why this case belongs in the history of modern policing. The public memory often keeps the image of the nursery window and the ransom note. The courtroom depended on slower things: bank tellers, shopkeepers, serial number lists, maps, a gas station attendant, and experts willing to explain why one piece of wood might matter. There is a lesson in that. Big cases can feel like they are solved by a single revelation. Often they are not. They are solved, or at least prosecuted, by an accumulation of small facts that refuse to disappear. At the center of the Lindbergh case was a child who did not survive. Everything else came after that. The fame, the newspapers, the false leads, the ransom exchange, the money trail, the ladder, the trial, and the arguments that still follow the verdict. For this video, the point is not to pretend the case was simple. It was not. The official record says Bruno Richard Hauptmann was convicted of the kidnapping and murder. It also shows a prosecution built from many different forms of evidence, rather than one perfect answer. That is why the case still matters. It shows the power of evidence.
It shows the limits of evidence. And it shows how a single crime can reshape law, policing, and public memory.
The sources used for this documentary include the FBI case history, the FBI Archive, the New Jersey State Archives, the Minnesota Historical Society, Britannica, and a legal history summary from famous trials. The details are in the source log for this project.